Hello, Ambassadors. Welcome to the final study in our series on foundations of our faith. Maybe you missed the class this week, or maybe you want to give some further reflection to the things we talked about. Maybe you're sharing it with someone else. Whatever brings you here, welcome. If you like what you see, hit the like button. And if you subscribe, you'll be notified whenever I post new videos to this channel. In our first lesson, we talked about the crucifixion of Jesus. In our second, we talked about his resurrection. In the third lesson, we talked about what it means to abide in Christ. And last week, we talked about the heart of discipleship. Today, we're looking to the future and talking about facing the future as we look at some passages from Matthew chapter 24 and 1 John chapter 3. We're going to discuss these things in class. Hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at the questions and give some thought to them. Before we get into our questions, though, let's look at our text. Before we look at our first 11 questions, let's look at our text from Matthew 24, 1 to 14 and 37 to 44. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Messiah,' and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you're not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." Now moving to verse 37. "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a hand mill, one will be taken and the other left. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him." So looking at chapter 24, verses 1 to 3, what is the occasion for this discussion? What is the question that this chapter primarily answers? Well, there are some observations we need to make in order to understand this section. First, the Olivet Discourse is prompted by the prospect of the destruction of the temple. That is the setting of the question and Jesus' answer. Its buildings appear so inviolable and indestructible, yet Jesus makes the claim not merely that the temple might be destroyed, but that it will be destroyed stone by stone. Second, the Olivet Discourse is in response to the disciples' questions on 2 fundamental issues. They ask 2 questions. First question is, when will this happen? That is, when will the destruction of the temple take place? When will the temple be destroyed? And the second question is, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Because you see, the way these questions are worded, the disciples clearly saw those two things as being contemporaneous. They're not asking, on the one hand, what will be the sign of your coming, and then, by the way, what will be the sign of the end of the age? The sign of your coming, as far as they're concerned, is the sign of the end of the age. Third, the discourse reveals Jesus as a prophet, predicting the future. He's not just analyzing contemporary culture or suggesting methods of discipleship. He's setting himself apart from those who would deceive and lead astray. And he calls for his disciples' complete allegiance to his words and predictions. And fourth, this discourse has a twofold focus, much like the Old Testament prophecies do. For example, when Nathan prophesies in 2 Samuel 7 verse 12 that David's offspring will sit on his throne, the prophecy has an immediate reference to Solomon, but an ultimate reference to Jesus Christ, the greater son of David. Similarly, here the predictions of this little apocalypse, as the chapter is sometimes called, focus in the near case on the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, but ultimately the end of the world. So when Jesus talks about the impact of a calamity so great that people had to flee to the mountains, and he expresses sorrow for those who will be pregnant and nursing infants in the days of this tribulation, he's focusing first on the fall of Jerusalem, which then becomes a symbol of the destruction of the world as we know it. There's one meaning to Jesus' words, but multiple applications of it. Question 2. Looking at verse 1, how did the disciples feel as they looked at these buildings? The site of the temple at Jerusalem was one of the most outstanding sites in the ancient world. It was built of white marble, it was plated with gold, it shone in the sunlight so that a person could hardly look at it. For the pilgrim to Jerusalem, to come to Mount Zion was an impressive call to reverence and worship. Some of the temple's large supporting stones that make up the support structure for the whole Temple Mount were 40 feet in length and they weighed hundreds of tons. The largest of those stones is 45 feet long, 13 feet wide, and it weighs about 600 tons. The cutting and moving of those colossal stones remains a mystery of ancient engineering. No doubt you've heard people speculate on how the great stones were pulled together to build the pyramids of Egypt. Well, the stones that are a part of the foundation for the Temple Mount are 10 times the size of the stones that were used in the pyramids. I've stood in amazement before these stones. And you will too when we go to Israel next year. And so the disciples, looking at the temple, they're impressed. I mean, these are just rural fishermen from Galilee. They're impressed by the majesty of this temple. In fact, I would tell you this. The temple was so majestic that if it had not been destroyed in 70 AD, it would absolutely have been listed as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But Jesus predicted its complete destruction because the end of the Jewish temple cult was at hand. There's going to be a new temple, a temple made up of living stones, Peter says, and that temple's yet to come. The people of God would be the temple of his presence no matter where they met. And the disciples asked the question, when is this going to happen? Well, let's look in a little more detail at what's going on here in Matthew chapter 24. Notice it says Jesus left the temple and was walking away. What is the significance of Jesus leaving the temple and going away from it? Well, his leaving symbolizes him abandoning the temple. It's unfortunate that we have a chapter division between chapter 23 and chapter 24. Because if you look at the end of chapter 23, you see Jesus talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, You who killed the prophets and stoned those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Well, what is that house that's being left desolate according to Jesus? It's clearly the temple. He's not talking about the city, he's talking about the temple. It was supposed to be God's house, but he refers to it as your house. What does it mean that it'll be left desolate? Well, it means it'll be deserted or abandoned or destroyed. Different translations translate the word in those ways. The idea is that God is going to forsake and destroy the temple. In this context, it refers to the fact that Jesus now leaves the temple in Matthew 24, verse 1. They've turned Jesus away, and now he leaves the temple, and they're left to themselves. Jesus leaving the temple is likened to the cloud of the Shekinah glory departing from the temple back in the days of the Babylonian exile. He's comparing his departure from the temple to God abandoning the temple to the Babylonians in 586 BC. The book of Ezekiel begins with Ezekiel wondering why the presence of God is with the exiles in Babylon rather than back in Jerusalem where he belongs. Ezekiel chapter 1. Well, the answer came in Ezekiel chapter 10, when he saw a vision of God moving out of the temple and moving in with the exiles before the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in 586 BC. And now what you've got is a repeat of that. When Jesus leaves the temple, it's tantamount to God abandoning the temple back in 586. That's the way Matthew 24 starts. Jesus left the temple and was walking away, a visual representation of what God had done in Ezekiel's day. Well, as he's walking away, his disciples came up to him and called his attention to the buildings. What were the disciples pointing out to Jesus? Well, they were pointing out the buildings of the temple. The word that's used here, incidentally, is the word hieros. It's the Greek word that describes the entire temple complex, not just the sanctuary, which would be called the naos. The hieros refers to the entire area of the temple complex. It includes the porticos, the gates, the walls, the buildings, and so on, not just the sanctuary, the temple itself. And Jesus says to them in response to their question, do you see all these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. At the time of its construction, the size and grandeur of the Temple Mount was admired by everyone. Mark 13, verse 1 corresponds with Matthew 24, 1, and it tells the story this way. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. The Jewish scholars in the Talmud said, He who didn't see Herod's building didn't see a magnificent building in his lifetime. So why did Jesus say, There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down, when we can clearly see that the walls still stand around the Temple Mount? Well, the walls that we see today were not ever a part of the temple complex. They were merely a supporting structure for the temple plaza and complex that sat on top of them. The plaza and complex occupied about 35 acres. When the Romans were done in 70 AD, every vestige of the temple complex had been destroyed. The only thing left was those supporting walls that we can still see today. And I believe that God left them as a perpetual reminder of what happens when His people persistently reject Him and rebel against Him. Well, look at verse 3. What two questions did the disciples ask? Here's the way the text reads. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? The fact that there is one definite article for the two nouns, coming and end, indicates that these two events were seen as occurring at the same time. The disciples evidently understood the end of the temple to mean the end of the age as well. So the two questions are, when will this destruction happen, and what will be the sign connected with Jesus coming and the end of the age? What do you know about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70? Well, Jesus clearly foresees this terrible event in 70 AD as the culmination in their lifetime of the events he's describing. Matthew 24, verse 34 makes that point when Jesus says, "This generation will not pass away until all these things be accomplished." Matthew 24 is primarily concerned with the fall of Jerusalem. It was a terrible siege. It lasted nearly 4 years, and it involved unimaginable hardships. The city was hard to capture, and it was defended with fanatical zeal. The Romans made a sustained attempt to starve its inhabitants into submission. Parents were reduced to cannibalism. There was unparalleled affliction, as Jesus had predicted in Matthew 24, verse 21. In 70 AD, the Roman troops determined as a last resort to storm the city and the temple, and that's what they did. The temple, one of the greatest architectural masterpieces of antiquity, made of marble and faced with gold, was smashed to pieces. The city was reduced to rubble. The carnage and slaughter were terrible. More than 1 million Jews died in the operation, and Josephus, who was there, tells us that more than 97,000 Jews were taken captive. The Romans were so pleased and relieved at the satisfactory solution of what they considered the Jewish problem, they erected Titus's Arch in the Forum at Rome to celebrate the victory. Well, in Matthew 24, verses 15 and 16, we have an interesting statement by Jesus that has caused a lot of consternation by people down through the ages. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So what is this abomination of desolation? Well, there are two words we need to look at. The first is the word translated abomination. Different translations treat it differently. Most use the word abomination because that's one we're most familiar with. But there are other translations that say sacrilege, or pollution, or terror, or horror, or horrible thing, or disgusting thing, detestable thing. The idea is of something in a specifically religious context that defiles a holy place and causes it to be abandoned or left desolate. Well, what does it mean to say desolation? The word is the Greek word from which the word desert comes. The idea is of a place that's been abandoned, and so it is desecrated, and God has moved out of it because of the desecration. So the question is, what is this abomination of desolation? Well, some people think it refers to a blasphemous invader who would come and destroy the temple, in which case it would be a reference to Titus and the Roman army entering the temple and destroying it and defiling it with their presence. Others think it might be a reference to something that was actually done by the Jewish zealots, because just before Titus and the Roman army invaded Jerusalem, the Jewish zealots gathered up 8,500 people who weren't as opposed to the Romans as they were. They herded them all into the temple courts and slaughtered them there. So either way, whether it was the slaughter of Jews by Jews or the slaughter of Jews by Romans, this sacrilege was a warning sign to people that disaster was about to occur. Notice in verse 15 and 16 that Jesus talks about this abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. So, what is the holy place? Well, as I mentioned before, there are two Greek words for the temple. One, the word hieron, has to do with the entire temple complex, but the other one, the word naos, has to do with the sanctuary, the holy place. So this is a reference to the temple itself. And notice that the readers of Matthew 24 are supposed to understand what Jesus is talking about. He says as much. Let the reader understand. So what does that parenthetical comment mean? Well, Jesus is telling anyone who reads Daniel 9:27 and Daniel 12:11 to recognize that what Daniel spoke of was about to take place. It's a parenthetical comment. It may be something that was said by Jesus, or it may be something that was inserted by Matthew. But in either case, the people in the first century who heard Jesus or read Matthew should understand what Jesus is talking about and how it fits into the story of Daniel. Now, the fact of the matter is, the Temple Mount has been desecrated many times down through history. In 586 BC, Babylon desecrated the Temple Mount. They destroyed the temple, and they hauled off hundreds of thousands of Jews into exile. Those that didn't get hauled off had to escape to Egypt or just had to live in a subsistence way in Israel. But the temple itself was destroyed by the Babylonians, and the Jews largely were deported to Babylon. It was during that time that Daniel's prophecy was written. So this is after Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed the temple, but while the Babylonian exile was going on, Daniel writes his prophecy, and he talks about this abomination of desolation. Well, what's he talking about? From Daniel's perspective, he was looking forward to a fellow named Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who in 167 BC desecrated the Temple Mount. He erected an altar of Zeus in the temple. He sacrificed a pig on the altar, thus desecrating the temple and launching the Maccabean revolt in 167 BC. That Maccabean revolt ended with the rededication of the temple in 164 BC and with the observance of Hanukkah that Jews still observe today. But when Jesus is speaking, he's looking forward to another event, 70 AD, when Titus and the Roman army desecrate the Temple Mount and destroy Jerusalem. Well, the Jews rebelled again in 135 AD, and Hadrian, after putting them down, renamed the city Aelia Capitolina and built a temple to Jupiter after the Bar Kokhba revolt, and that temple to Jupiter was right there on the Temple Mount, once again desecrating the Temple Mount. Today, when you look at the Temple Mount, you see that Islam has desecrated the Temple Mount. 688 AD, the building of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock has been a desecration on that mount ever since then. So how many of the things mentioned in Matthew 24 happened during the lifetime of the disciples? Well, Matthew 24 verse 34 has Jesus saying, "I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." So everything Jesus described in verses 4 to 28, everything he talked about refers primarily to the approach of the Roman armies and the defiling of the temple in the Jewish war that occurred between 66 and 70 AD. R.C. Sproul makes this observation. It's one thing for us to ask how Jesus' teaching applies to us, It's quite another to ask what it meant in its original context. We must keep in mind that Jesus was answering questions posed by his disciples, questions about when his previous utterances would be fulfilled. His words were directed to them. The calamities that Jesus talks about, including famines, pestilence, earthquakes, wars, all of those things that he describes as the beginning of sorrows, he's placing right before the destruction of Jerusalem, in the period of time between his ascension and the destruction of Jerusalem. By the way, how much of the book of Revelation happened during the first century? Going back to R.C. Sproul, he says, I'm convinced that the substance of the Olivet Discourse was fulfilled in AD 70, and that the bulk of Revelation was likewise fulfilled in that time frame. So how do we know what of these verses apply to the second coming and what apply to the destruction of Jerusalem? Most people look at Matthew chapter 24, and they have this idea that somehow what happened to Jerusalem in 70 AD foreshadows what's going to happen at the end of time. Well, let me give you a few things to think about. The moon is much smaller than the sun, but it's also much closer to us. And because of that, if the moon comes between us and the sun, the moon can obscure the sun from our sight, and that's what happens in a solar eclipse. A quarter is much smaller than the moon, but it's also much closer to us. And because of that, it can also obscure the moon from our sight. Here's another way to imagine these things. Think about the events through time as occurring in a series of mountain peak moments. When Daniel wrote his prophecy during the time of the Babylonian exile, he's looking forward to a fellow named Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who in 167 BC destroyed the temple. That's the Abomination of Desolation that Daniel talks about from his own perspective. However, when Jesus talks about the same thing and refers to the Abomination of Desolation, he makes application of it talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, another mountain peak way down in the future. But then, when he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, we see that he's also talking about his second coming, and we don't know when that's going to take place. So it's very much like looking at a series of mountains. The ones that are nearer, we can see in greater detail. The ones that are farther, we can only get a glimpse of. But even though they might be much higher and much more impressive than the ones that are nearby to us. Another way of thinking about it is, you've heard that saying, you can't see the forest for the trees. If you look at a leaf very closely, you can see a lot of detail about that leaf. You can see a leaf in greater detail than you can see a tree. Because when you look at trees, you don't see the detail of the leaves. You see the detail of the trees instead. But when you back up a little further and you look at the forest, you can see that there are leaves and you can see that there are trees, but you don't see either of them in as much detail. That's sort of the way it is with prophecy. The things that are closer to you in time are told in greater detail than the things that are more remote and distant. We'll look at Matthew 24:14. What does it mean that this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world and then the end will come? People look at that and they say, well, surely Jesus is talking about the final coming, the second coming, the end of the world, because he talks about the gospel being preached in the whole world. Well, what we need to understand is, to the New Testament writer's perspective and to the perspective of the Roman Empire, the world was the Roman Empire and the Roman Empire was the world. As a matter of fact, you'll notice that the Roman Empire circles an area called the Mediterranean Sea. Well, the name Mediterranean literally means middle of the earth. And so, as far as the Roman Empire was concerned, that was the world. Matthew 24, verses 36 to 44. What is the most important thing to remember about the second coming? Well, I think the most important thing to remember is the thing that Jesus said in Matthew 24, verse 36. But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Matthew 24:37. How will the final days be like the days of Noah? We'll notice how Jesus described it in verses 38 and 39. In those days before the flood, the people were enjoying banquets and parties and weddings right up to the time Noah entered his boat. People didn't realize what was going to happen until the flood came and swept them all away. That is the way it will be when the Son of Man comes. Jesus' point is that the sinful people of that day were unprepared for God's judgment. They were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. Their worldly lifestyle was an ongoing pattern, and it would have gone on without interruption if God had not brought the flood. The people continued in their self-indulgence up to the day Noah entered the ark. They had an entire century to observe Noah and his sons building the ark and to hear Noah's testimony concerning God's anger at their sin and his coming judgment. But they didn't recognize the warning until it was too late. The judgment of the flood took them all away because they remained stubborn and ignorant of their coming doom. There are really only two groups of people. One group is paralyzed because they see the end just around the corner. Everywhere they look, they think the end is near. The other group is oblivious to the fact that there ever will be an end. Like these two fellows walking with a sign. One says the end is near, the other one says this will never end, and the one who says this will never end says, "Your optimism disgusts me." One of my favorite podcasts is a podcast called Hardcore History by a fellow named Dan Carlin. Well, in 2019, just before COVID-19 swept the world, he wrote a book called The End is Always Near. And he examined apocalyptic moments going all the way back to the Hittites and the collapse of the Bronze Age. His thesis was that every civilization has existed on the brink of collapse, and he shows how it's happened time and time again. That's a theme that runs through the Old Testament prophets. Read the prophets. You'll read about the day of the Lord. You'll read about the coming of the Lord. You'll read about the Lord riding on a cloud. And every time you see one of those predictions of the day of the Lord or the coming of the Lord or the Lord riding on a cloud, God is about to judge a godless nation. It might be Assyria, it might be Edom, it might be Babylon or Israel, or even Judah. I think it was notable that when Dan Carlin wrote this book, it was before COVID-19 hit, and he closes it out talking about pandemics. And then along comes COVID-19. Now, as far as I know, Dan Carlin's not a believer, but every time I read or listen to him, I can see how biblical themes of the day of the Lord, the coming of the Lord, and the day of judgment fit all throughout human history. Question 11. Looking at verse 42, what is the application to the doctrine of the second coming to our day and our lives? What difference does an understanding of the second coming make to us? Well, I think the thing we have to remember is from verse 42. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. That's the reason for his exhortation to continual diligence. That's the way Jesus summarizes how we ought to respond to the fact of the coming. He's going to come. He's come before and destroyed nation after nation. He's come before and destroyed the temple time and again. He's going to come yet again. And when he returns, will we be ready? Well, we don't want to end on a note of despair. So let's turn to our next text, 1 John 3, verses 1 to 3. See what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called the children of God. And that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Dear friends, now we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known. But we know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. All who have this hope in him purify themselves, just as he is pure. Well, what is the application of that text to the teaching of the second coming? How does a believer face the future? We've received God's promise of complete restoration, and we live in hope that God will fulfill this promise. So John states a fact. Everyone who has this hope purifies himself. He's not expressing a wish, may he purify himself. He's not expressing a possibility, he may purify himself. He's not expressing a command, he ought to purify himself. He's stating this fact in positive terms. Believers live in the hope of becoming conformed to Jesus Christ, and the more we contemplate this truth, the more we purify ourselves of sin. We seek to cleanse ourselves from sin that contaminates body and soul. We constantly strive for holiness in our reverence to God, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 7:1. We do this just as he, that is Jesus, is pure. In the preceding chapters, John writes that if we have fellowship with Jesus, he cleanses us from sin through his blood. That's 1 John 1:7. And if we claim to have fellowship with him, we have to walk as he did. That's 1 John 2, verse 6. So John stresses moral purity, which every believer must demonstrate by living a life of holiness. John points to the standard. As Christ is pure, so his followers must strive for purity. Because Jesus lived without sin, he was pure, believers who have this hope of seeing Christ and being like him want to purify themselves. To purify means to be morally and ethically free from the corruption of sin. People can do this only through Christ's Spirit in them because, as Jesus said, apart from me you can do nothing. That's John 15, verse 5. This is an ongoing cleansing process. It begins at rebirth and continues until the day Jesus returns. The purer his people become, the clearer will be their view of Jesus, who is pure through and through. Now, God also purifies Christians. But the point of John here is that we have to take steps ourselves to remain morally pure. Well, that's our final lesson on foundations of the faith. We've talked a little bit about facing the future, and I hope that's been helpful to you. I'll be gone next week to Texas, and while I'm gone, Pastor Kim Harrell will be teaching the class. I know you'll enjoy him as you have in the past. When I return, we're going to do a series of lessons, 8 lessons in all, beginning June 12, looking at some of the Psalms of David. I call it His Life in His Lyrics. I hope you'll join us for that series of lessons beginning June 12. In the meantime, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.